I put together a short PowerPoint just to go over a couple things about some of the data-driven approaches for understanding the role of police better. As Tim said, I'm a senior researcher at RTI International. I also run the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. So our society, it's a nonprofit organization. We're actually open to membership. You could be a community member, a professor, a student. It's complete transparency. What we try to do is translate the research that's out there for the layperson to really, because what we've seen with journal articles is a lot of times the methods part or even just the acronyms, like it's not user-friendly, I guess, in a way for the the reader that just wants to learn about policing and research. So we at the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, we translate it into a two-page brief. So people, if they want to learn about police practices that have been tested, they could get those briefs. We also have a partnership with Justice Clearinghouse that gives webinars on all things policing, which is another great resource for people. But there's a lot of tools nowadays for community members to look at what the police are doing in their areas. Most police departments actually put a lot of their data on their websites. They put their crime data. A lot of them are moving to where their officers are doing their proactive activity out in the field. So there's ways to use the tools and the data to examine what exactly are the police doing in your community. And also, I was a police officer for 22 years in the Sacramento Police Department. So when I'm speaking about a lot of times like what police officers do, I'm speaking both from my experience and as an outside researcher. And I always tell people, I was a cop for 22 years, but I was also a Sacramento Police Department cop. So that means like I know my agency really well. I know Sacramento really well. So sometimes I've done interviews before, where they will ask me questions about these type of incidents that they've seen. And for me, I think I just got really lucky that I worked in a really good agency that had a really good internal affairs department, and I was always trained to treat people really well. So some of my experience, over the 22 years is I felt like we had a really professional police organization, and I got really lucky. Because like I said, had I had some of those experiences, I probably wouldn't have lasted for 22 years. But for RTI, we are a nonprofit research organization. We've been around since 1950. We were set up by 3 different universities. So Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, and then North Carolina State University came together and decided to develop a nonprofit research institute. So besides doing police research, we have research across the board for all different types of issues. I've only been with RTI since January, so I couldn't even tell you half the research we do. But what we do in my area, it's applied police research. So we try to look at what the officers are doing in the field and how that impacts the community, how that impacts crime. And some of our focus areas are, as you can see on the screen, the justice, safety, and resilience, race and health equity, victimization, victim services. We advocate for evidence-based policing strategies. We do investigative science, agency workforce, workplace challenges, law enforcement, communities, and victims. So some of the research we have going on right now, we have, we're looking at health and wellness apps that the officers use out in the field. We're looking at the recruitment and retention of female officers, because the research shows that the more female officers you have on your force, they actually use less force than their male counterparts. So we have research going on in that area. We are currently, another project we have is a calls for service analytics software project. So RTI has created a calls for service analytics software where both for the officers driving the vehicles and for the calls that are coming in. It analyzes all the calls that are coming in on a daily basis, and it shows the police chiefs how many calls are coming in when they have the highest workloads. And if there is the AVL data in the vehicles, it can show where the officers are in the field at any moment in time. And you could show within the software, you can show when they're driving faster than 20 miles per hour, when they're going over 20 miles per hour. So you could get an idea of, you know, the difference between when an officer, and I'm not saying like speeding through your neighborhood, but more like when they're not patrolling it, they're not there to try to find any kind of stops or traffic enforcement. They're probably going to a call or something like that, versus when they're driving very slowly and you could tell that they're trying to do some type of proactive enforcement. And then you could also use a system to look at when they are en route to a call or coming off on a call. And all of these tools are really just good data to have, because you could tell like what the officers collectively are doing. And some of the issues that we're having, you know, that you see across the United States is, I've been saying for a while now, is that we collectively as a profession have to get away from our independent contractor model of policing. So currently, officers, the way we're set up is we go into roll call, we get our assignment, and then we go out and patrol really where we want to patrol between calls for service. Depending on the agency you work for, you could be so busy that some officers would probably say, well, what do you mean it's an independent, you know, contractor model? I'm so busy, I go call to call to call to call, which can be true. I've had those days, I've had those areas of my city where that is all I do. But there's also those days of the week and those months of the year where you're not as busy. And so between calls for service, you're patrolling where you want, and then you're also looking to arrest for the crimes you want. And what I mean by that is, you know, back in the 80s and 90s, you might be looking to make a drug arrest. You might know where the known prostitution stroll is, so you go down there and you're looking to make that type of arrest. Or you have information on parolees, so you're looking to make that type of arrest. So officers tend to develop this skill set of either what they're good at finding or what they enjoy finding. And that's what I mean by like an independent contractor model, is there's no focused from the executive management down saying, here's how we're going to approach the city or the neighborhood as a collective whole for this shift, for this week, for this month. So something like the calls for service data analytics tool, that is something that could shift from this independent contractor model into a more of an executive management model of managing where the officers are and what they're doing. So we also have, as I was saying, our Center for Policing Research and the Investigative Science. So on the investigative science side, that's, I'm sure people have seen, you know, the CSI shows. That's more of our forensic side, looking at all of the ways that we could develop the tools and the technology to advance our sciences. So that way we make sure that, you know, we're solving crimes faster, we're finding suspects faster, because we want to make sure that we're taking care of the victims on the victim side. One of our projects we have right now that we have funded, it was going to be following up on burglary victims, but due to COVID, we couldn't make, the research project couldn't turn into what we had originally had envisioned for it. So now we're creating a chat bot, and we've named her Eva because she's an enhanced victim advocate. So the idea is, if you can't send out somebody to follow up with the burglary victims, can we build a bot that police departments can use, and she can answer all of the, if victims have questions and follow-up questions, can she answer some of those questions and make it really easy and simple for victims after a burglary if they have follow-up questions? Because those are the things that we see in policing quite a bit is, you know, there's traumatic fallout when somebody is a victim of a crime, and often we don't have those resources. But nowadays we have the technology and we have people who are really smart And we've advanced so far in the last 20, 30 years that we could build these type of things for victims to where we could help them with the process. So this is our focus areas. It's a little repetitive from the beginning, but the data-driven applications, really looking at, workforce and workplace challenges, the investigative sciences I just kind of went over. But we're also really, the other thing that we have going on, and I'm horrible with slides, I create them every time, but then I get ahead of myself, is we have a big project going on with the North Carolina cities. There's almost 6 or 7 different cities where we're working with the city personnel rather than the police departments, trying to help them use their data to drive their decision making. So there's been a lot of outcry about defund the police, and most of the defund the police conversations seem to be coming from this emotional reaction of I'm angry and I'm upset, and here's all the reasons why I believe we shouldn't have police involved with the community anymore. But really, and we've seen this in Minneapolis already, that the Minneapolis City Council, half of them were on board for, yes, let's defund the police, let's find a new way of doing things. And the minute they started shutting down the officers going out and dealing with some of their crime issues, you have their violence and the shootings ramping up, and you have victims coming forward saying, you cannot take our police away, this is what keeps us safe. So there's a balance there. You have to figure out ways to keep your community safe, but not over police and not damage the relationships you have. So we're working with these cities in North Carolina to examine their data, to look at, first of all, you have to look at what type of calls are coming in. So when people were advocating for defund the police, they weren't examining their data first to say, okay, if we're going to have some type of mental health advocate go out, well, how many calls are even mental health related? And then of those calls, how many of them, have a weapon? And of those calls that don't have weapons, how many of them have violent behavior? And then how many of those calls that they don't have violent behavior might you need to still put somebody, in California we call it a 5150 hold, but put them on a mental health hold, which is really the only person that can do that as a police officer, is to take them into custody. And even when you get around all of that, so then you get down to this set of calls. So say of, whatever percent of calls you have, let's say you have 50% of those that a mental health professional could answer. Well, then you have to look at your workforce. Do you have mental health professionals available that wanted to work in the field, that they wanted to go out by themselves, or maybe with a police officer, and they wanted to work in the field with the mentally ill? Because that might not be the lifestyle that they saw for themselves. That when they became a mental health professional, they saw themselves in an office working with the mentally ill, or in a hospital, or those type of environments. So switching into this new environment, you might not have a workforce that's ready to take on that role out in the field, and you might not have a workforce that's ready to deal with when things don't work out the way you think they will when somebody's having a mental health issue. So we're working with the agencies to really examine their data. Then once you figure out what all your data shows, then examining the evidence, what research do we have to show that certain approaches are effective or certain approaches are efficient. Then let's start applying those interventions. And when we start applying those interventions, are there ways that we could set up a research design to actually determine if those outcomes are effective and efficient? Because often in policing, what we do is binary percent changes. Is we say, oh, crime's going up, we did something, crime's going down, it must have worked. But if you look at data and statistics, if you understand data, you understand that there's random variation and fluctuations within data. And if you're just looking at small snapshots, like weekly data sets of crime or calls for service, you're going to get this random fluctuation. So if you do an intervention at some point in there and you don't have a large data set, you're going to essentially be examining random fluctuations, and you're going to be unsure if it's really your intervention that made the crime come down, or if it was just the crime regressing to the mean, is what it's called. But this is something that we're trying to help. As I said, it's the city leadership that is working with RTI versus the police department. And I think in some ways that's not a bad approach, because then you're giving the police department a level of space to where it's not the police department making the decisions. So when the community is upset or doesn't agree with how the strategy is being rolled out, they have a level of distance, which I think is helpful, at least for right now while you're trying out these new things. And the idea really is that you want to create this, community of safety, engagement, and trust. And these are all the things that really go into building that, and the outcome measures that we want to look at. So you want to look at the community socio-demographics that you have in your community. You want to look at your use of force incidents that are going on in your police department. You want to look at the law enforcement characteristics, like what is the race breakdown of your police department? What is the gender breakdown of your police department? How diverse are you? What type of proactive community engagement is your police department engaging in? What are the levels of reported crime and calls for service? And then what are the community responses? Because the other thing we know from the research is really that crime and calls for service is fairly stable. If you map out your city's crime and calls for service by street segment, not criminal density mapping, but if you map by street segment and you map 3 years of data versus 1 year of data versus 90 days of data, it'll probably all look the same. You're going to show that crime really doesn't move much. It's in the same areas, it's generational. So instead of patrolling your whole city and doing proactive engagement throughout the whole city, it's better just to focus on the areas that are having those kind of problems, because it's a community issue and it's a societal issue that stems from the environment that is occurring there. And there's all kinds of things that occur in that environment, but you have data that'll tell you where that's coming from. So it's a matter of examining that data and then looking at how do we intervene to make the neighborhood or whatever, how do we change that? How do we change 20, 30, 40 years of crime and calls for service and make it better? One of the tools that we have that's available online is our STAR Statistical Traffic Analysis Report. This is a lot of times what you'll see is when people report out on traffic stop data, what they will do is do population data. And they'll say, this police agency stopped this many African Americans, like 15% of African Americans, but the population only has 8%. So that shows that there's, implicit bias, there's disparate contacts. But population data, there's a whole guide by Lori Friedel out of the University of Florida that talks about the different benchmarks. And one of the worst ones is population data. It's just not a very good measure of what is occurring if you're going to look at bias, right? So this Veil of Darkness study was done by Groger and Ridgway, the two researchers that looked at, okay, if we're going to examine traffic stops and we're going to look at if is race a disparate contact issue, then we don't want to look at population. We want to look at like who's being stopped when. So they came up with the idea of looking at the stops during daylight versus darkness. So the theory behind it is if it's dark, you really can't tell the race of the person driving or who's in the car. So your stops at the same time when it's light should be the same breakdown when it's dark. And the nice thing about the STAR tool is that it's online. If you just Google STAR Statistical Traffic Analysis Report, it's online. And if you have your police department's data, so if you have the date and the time and the race, like to dump in on an Excel spreadsheet, it'll run it for you. So the nice thing is with a very little bit of amount of data, you could run this with your police department, and or you should be able to ask your police department to do this, and hopefully they're transparent enough and willing to be a little introspective that they should run this themselves and report back to say, hey, this is what we found. Because a lot of this stuff, it shouldn't be used as, oh my gosh, you're a horrible agency and you have horrible police officers. It should be used as a learning tool to say, hey, this is data and it gives you information. And we're not going to judge you for it, but we would like to see how you're going to use that data to improve on what you do. It's what most professions do, so it's something that we should be doing also. This is a project I was telling you a little bit about, the NC cohort of cities. So like I said, it's pretty much all the cities. We're breaking it down, and this is what it looks like. So using the calls for service to see how they're coming in, standardizing how we look at it, how we're going to analyze those calls for service data, and then inventory all those calls. The other thing, they've done studies, excuse me, in this they're going to convene working groups, but there is a really good article that looked at the crossover between EMS and fire, and they've shown that the crossover there for calls for service is about 30% for most cities. So you really have this opportunity to take a big portion of your calls for service and probably triage it in a way that can reduce either your police citizen contact or reduce the waste of having a fire department going out. But there's ways to reduce some of the waste in some sense. And the idea behind this also is to reduce that police citizen contact. Because if we could still keep our cities safe, keep your crime down, keep your calls for service down, keep your citizens happy, because a lot of citizens still want the police to come when they call, and that is a service the cities provide, then you still want to make sure that you're reducing, like if you're reducing that contact with the police, you still want to keep all these things like in balance, right? You don't want to reduce contact and then have crime go up. You don't want to reduce contact and have your mentally ill, becoming victims because they're out unprotected. So at the end of this, the idea is to really reduce your low-level misdemeanor arrests, like maybe arrests that really don't need to occur, reduce your complaints, and reduce your use of force. And this is, like I said, this is the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. That's our website on the bottom. And besides the American Society, there's a Canadian Society, there is a British Society, and an Australian New Zealand Society. So this is what we all advocate for, is the use of research in policing. This is something that I see that it's starting to take hold here in America. It is advanced much more in other countries that have more centralized policing than we have here in the US. But I think here in the US, there's a lot of police chiefs that are starting to understand what evidence-based policing is, and to want to understand the research and want to test some of their practices. So to me, it's getting some traction, which I think like this cohort of NC cities is where you're starting to see now with what we have going on in the US is police departments and police chiefs are really reaching out to say, we've stood on the back of tradition for too long. And so now we are willing to take a look at the research and the data to drive our police practices and our strategies. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Renee. That was very fascinating. And I know you have to run, but people can email you, correct, if they have any questions about the presentation?
Oh yeah, definitely. And feel free to, I'm on Twitter too. So I answer all kinds of questions on Twitter. My husband makes fun of me, but I've got all kinds of Twitter friends that I love to follow and I love to exchange information with. But yeah, any questions on email, feel free. Or if you want articles too, I often share articles with people when they find something that they think is interesting and they want more information on. I will help anybody with anything they need.